What does it mean for you personally? I'm curious in terms of what makes you tick. If it's not happiness that we're in the pursuit of, what is your personal mission and meaning then?
So for me, all of my books are about questions that I'm not an expert, I'm a journalist, right? So when I start, of course, I have some guesses, but I don't know the answers to the questions I'm going to ask.
But you
So,
go and find them. That's the interesting thing.
but for me, that's about, so for example, chasing the scream. I wanted to know, well, what causes addiction? What
Yeah.
is it? Has anywhere in the world solved this problem? What's going on here, right? With lost connections, why has depression gone up so much? With stolen focus, my most recent book, why are we all finding it so hard to pay attention? What can we do about it? And for me, that's driven by a few things. I think one is just curiosity. It's really interesting to find this stuff out, right? To go and meet people who've done these fascinating experiments, and you're like, oh, and there's the joy of having something explained to you that you didn't understand. You feel like you start to feel like, oh, we've all had that joy of when you hear something, go, oh, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So partly it's curiosity, partly it's just self-interest, right?
Yeah.
In the case of depression and focus, I wanted to understand these things for myself.
That's for me. Yeah.
And partly it's love for the people who have these problems, right?
Hello and welcome to another exclusive interview by Recovery Today Magazine at recoverytodaymagazine.com. Well, first and foremost, we're a magazine of hope. Whether you're considering addiction recovery for yourself or a loved one, or maybe you're actively in recovery a little while or long time, you're going to find all kinds of topics related to addiction recovery and really living a happy, successful, and sober life. My name is Rob Hanley, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Recovery Today, and I am so excited about this interview today. This is the second time that we have featured this gentleman, and because his work is so incredibly thought-provoking, and he really, literally does the miles to get to the heart of actually the subject matter that he's writing on. He's a British writer and journalist. In the truest sense, an investigative reporter. I would say he's written for the world's leading newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, LA Times, The Guardian, The Spectre, Le Monde Diplomatique, the Melbourne Age, Politico. He's a regular panelist on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. He's written on addiction and depression and the monarchy, two blockbuster books, which I literally devoured: Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression, and Unexpected Solutions, and their unexpected solutions. And the other book, Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs. His third book, which is forthcoming, will be coming out, called Stolen Focus: Why You Can't Pay Attention, is about to be released. And I will be devouring this book as well. My guest today is Johann Hari. Thank you for taking some time.
Oh, it's lovely to be with you again, Rob. Thanks very much.
So I love your work. I discovered you on TED Talk, on a TED Talk all about addiction. It blew my mind away. I was elated that we could feature you in our June 2019 edition of Recovery Today. But for our listeners or readers that might not know about you, tell us a little bit about your background, but maybe more importantly, how you got into becoming an investigative journalist, and why addiction and depression and focus. Why is your passion, it seems, upon mental health in this particular area?
I grew up in a family with a lot of addiction. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to, and I didn't understand why then. But as I got older, I realized we had addiction in my family, several members of my family, and we still do. And, I was in a slightly weird position. Like, my parents both left school when they were 16. All of my grandparents left school when they were 13 or 14. And I kind of got to get a fancy education. I got to go to Cambridge University. My dad was a bus driver. It wasn't that I came from privilege or anything, but and when I got that kind of very lucky fancy education, I wanted to use it to think about the places I come from, and so one of the things I wanted to investigate was, what causes addiction and what we can do about it, which you and I discussed last time I was with you, and I think for my most recent book, Stolen Focus, I mean, it's very thematically related. I think it's partly about some addictive behaviors that are actually very widely spread in our society now.
Yes.
I had noticed that my own ability to pay attention was getting worse. I noticed that lots of the people I knew, their ability to pay attention was getting
Me
worse.
too.
For a long time, I would reassure myself by saying, "Oh, but doesn't every generation think that, right? You can find 1,000 years ago one monk writing to another, going, "Oh, my attention ain't what it used to be." But actually, it was particularly when I looked at the young people in my life that I began to think, no, there's something really wrong here. A lot of them were whirring at the speed of Snapchat. Like nothing still could touch them, and I was kind of struck by some of the early research. One study found that the average American college student now focuses on any one task for just 65 seconds. In fact, the median amount of time they focus is 19 seconds. The average American office worker now focuses on any one task for 3 minutes. And I began to think, well, what's going on here, right? So I ended up going on a big journey all over the world, from Miami to Moscow to Melbourne. And I interviewed over 200 of the leading experts in the world about what boosts focus and what causes it to degrade. And I learned that there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can cause your attention to get worse, and loads of them have been sharply rising in recent years. And we really are in a deep attention crisis that we're going to have to solve together.
Why is it that I always look to think like, well, what do we get out of it? It's very easy to say, well, we're not focusing, but why is it important that we slow down, that we calm down? I mean, what do we gain by regaining our focus? I know that it's frustrating for me. And I get very down on myself, like what's wrong with me? I have a degree in electrical and computer engineering, which at one time required me to hyper focus for 90 minutes without there was nothing at a clip on some very intense things. Is it that we're losing the joy of our life? Is it that we're not as productive? What is it that we want to accomplish by regaining our focus and acknowledging that there's a problem?
Just think about what you're saying about blaming yourself, because that's exactly what I would do. I would say, oh, you're being weak, you're being lazy. And then I had this moment very early in the research for the book that really shook me. I went to interview a man called Professor Roy Baumeister, who is the leading expert in the world on willpower. He wrote a book called Willpower. If anyone's heard of the psychology experiment, the marshmallow test, he's the guy who invented that, right? So I go to see him, and I said to him, he's at the University of Queensland in Australia. And I said to him, I'm thinking of writing a book about whether people's attention is getting worse. And he said, it's funny you should ask that, because I found I can't pay attention a lot of the time now. I just play video games on my phone. And I was sitting there, I was like, wait a minute. Didn't you write a book called Willpower? I was like, geez, if your attention is getting worse, if you're sitting there saying this to me. So that was one of those sledgehammer moments where I was like, okay, there's something going on here. And we need to get out of blaming ourselves, because your attention did not collapse. Your attention has been stolen from you by some very powerful forces that I'm sure we're going to talk about. It's why the book is called Stolen Focus. But in terms of why it's so important that we get it back, anyone listening, think about something you've achieved in your life. Maybe you've been a good mother. Maybe you've set up a business. Maybe you've been kind to someone. Anything good you've ever done, it required sustained attention and focus. You had to think about one thing in depth for a good amount of time. What we know is when people's ability to pay attention and focus breaks down, their ability to achieve their goals breaks down. And that's true. A short-term goal, like I want to, sit on that sofa and read a book, or even something as simple as I want to go to the fridge and get a Diet Coke. If you're constantly distracted, happens at a short-term level, and it happens at a longer-term level. Not just I want to read a book, but I want to set up a business. I want to write a book. I want to change my job. Anything you want to do that is meaningful requires attention and focus.
Yes, I agree.
And if life dissolves into 65-second a hailstorm of 65-second moments of distraction, your ability to achieve goals begins to collapse. And that's why not being able to pay attention feels so bad, right?
Yep. Is the idea of multitasking then complete bullshit? Because I think like you, and reading your other two books and interviewing and just having a sense, like I know that I have ADD, and I purposely frame that as an asset that I can do a lot of different things. And there is kind of this badge that we wear a bit in society and business that I can just knock that shit right out. Like I'm very fast. Like I can knock out this. I know technology. I can do this, that, and the other. While I'm doing this, while I'm doing that, while I'm doing the other thing, easy peasy, no problem at all. Is it a myth then to multitask? Like I think like I can do this and this and this and this all at the same time.
I went to interview one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, a man named Professor Earl Miller at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he said to me, there's one thing about the human brain you have to understand more than anything else. You can only think about one thing consciously at a time. That's it. The human brain has not significantly changed in 40,000 years. It ain't going to change on any time scale you and I are going to see. You can only think about one thing at a time. But he said what's happened is we've convinced ourselves, exactly like you said, and I would have said, that we can do many things at a time. The average American teenager now believes they can follow 7 forms of media at the same time. So what they do is they get people into labs and they watch them do it. They're like, okay, you can do lots of things. They give them many tasks to do at the same time. And what they discovered is when you think you're doing lots of things at the same time, what you're actually doing is you're juggling. You're moving very rapidly from one task to another. And it turns out that comes with a really big series of costs. The technical term for it is the switch cost effect. So I'll give you 2 little examples of experiments that have shown this, and talk a little bit about some of the other effects. Hewlett Packard, the company that make printers, shitty printers that always jam up, in my opinion.
They are shitty.
Oh my God. The worst words in the English language are paper jam. But anyway, Hewlett Packard commissioned a scientist to work with their some of their workers. And he divided their workers into 2 groups. And the first group was told, just do whatever your task is for the day and you're not going to be interrupted. And the second group was told, do whatever your task is for the day and you're going to have to answer a pretty heavy amount of email and phone calls. And then they tested the IQ. After it's been going on for a while, the IQ of both groups. The group that had not been distracted tested on average 10 IQ points higher than the group that had not been distracted. To give you a sense of how big that is, when you smoke cannabis and get stoned, your IQ falls by 5 points. So it's double the effect in the short term of getting stoned. So you would be better off sitting at your desk, getting stoned and doing one thing at a time than sitting at your desk, not getting stoned and being constantly interrupted with email and text messages, right?
What a way to put it, man. That is so funny.
Well, think about another.
I've got a whole. I know that our time is limited, so I'm going to try to whip out almost in the ADD sense. That's hilarious.
Well, think about another study that was done. Right, it was done by Carnegie Mellon University,
Yes.
Human Computer Interaction Lab. They got 138 students. They split them into 2 groups. The first group is told. They're both groups are given the same exam. First group is told, do this exam in normal exam conditions. Second group is told, do the exam and you can leave your phone on and you can send and receive text messages.
Wow.
Now, you would expect the second group to do better. They could have cheated, right?
Sure.
The second group, on average, did 20% worse.
Wow.
And the reason is, if you are distracted, if your focus is pulled away from what you're doing, it takes, on average, Professor Michael Posner at the University of Oregon found, it takes 23 minutes if you're interrupted to get back to the same level of focus that you had before the interruption. But most people never get 23 minutes clear. So we're constantly living at this diminished level. The way Professor Miller put it to me is we live in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of all this distraction. And that has a whole series of effects. So when you're switching between tasks, it has a whole series of effects. So you get the switch cost effect where your brain is just jammed up, you're refocusing, that takes a lot of mental energy. It also has an effect on your memory. It takes mental energy to convert your experiences into memory. If you are constantly switching between tasks, you just remember less. There's evidence that you make more mistakes when you're switching between tasks. And also, you become significantly less creative over time.
Isn't it ironic that we're trying to be more productive? And it sounds like all of the research says, no, this is the wrong way. Like, I'm going to do 10 social medias at one time, or I'm going to do this at one time. But we're actually less, because the whole idea is like, I think where it comes from actually is a soul kind of a perspective. Like I want to be more valuable, right? That I'm, I'm a guy that you don't fire, that you don't get rid of, because I could do 10% people's work, but we're actually less effective. So
Yeah.
why is it that I and you affect maybe everybody that suffers this? Why do I feel this insatiable desire for more information? Like I almost can't go into Facebook now. They have the Facebook forgot what they're calling them. They're like TikTok videos. These
Yeah,
little
moment
1 minute.
moments. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so if I fall into that and watch one, I can burn an hour just like that. Like, why is it that I have this insatiable, or I can read things or I see things or people texting? I have this insatiable desire for more information.
There's a lot of things going on there, but one of them is that the current social media apps that we use are designed maximally to invade and hack your attention. And the most encouraging thing to understand, because my book Stolen Focus is about how we solve these problems, is that social media doesn't have to work that way. And there are specific changes we can make that would stop it working that way. So I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley interviewing the people who designed this world in which we live.
On purpose this way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fascinating because so many of them were horrified by had been destroyed by their own creations. There's a wonderful man named Dr. James Williams, I think the most important philosopher of attention in the world right now, former Google engineer who was involved in creating a lot of this stuff. And he was speaking at a tech conference a few years ago in front of, the people who design the stuff that your kids are using all the time, that we're using all the time. And he said to them, if there's anybody here who wants to live in the world we're creating, put up your hand. And nobody put up their hand, right? And it was fascinating to talk to Dr. Williams and many other people who've done this, who are now fighting against their own creations, like Dr. Frankenstein in the parable, and explaining how we can fix it. So there was a moment, what's gone wrong and how we can put it right really fell into place for me. I was talking with Tristan Harris, another former Google engineer, brilliant person, who's now fighting for reform. He said to me, you open Facebook now, Facebook will give you loads of options. It'll tell you loads of things. It'll tell you whose birthday it is. It'll tell you who tagged you in a photo. It'll tell you what you said on the same day 10 years before. There's one thing Facebook won't do. There's no button on Facebook that says something like, I'd like to meet up with my friends. Is there anyone nearby who'd like to meet up?
Oh, wow.
Now, the minute I say that, everyone listening will think, well, that'd be a really useful thing to have. I'd really like to have that button,
exactly.
right? The technology to do it exists like in an hour, right? Loads of dating apps work that way. Why won't Facebook provide us with that? If you follow the trail from that question, you begin to understand how our attention is being invaded and how we can get it back.
Wow.
So when you open Facebook, Facebook makes money in two ways. The first way is very obvious. You see ads in your feed. We all know how that works. The second way is much more important. Everything you do on Facebook is scanned and sorted by Facebook's algorithms to gather a profile, to build a profile of who you are. So let's say that you click that you like, I don't know, Bette Midler, Donald Trump, and you say to your mother that you have just bought some diapers. Okay, so the app has figured out if you're a man who likes Bette Midler, you're probably gay. If you like Donald Trump, you're probably conservative. And you just bought diapers, you probably got a baby, right? They've got tens of thousands of data points like that about you because you are not the customer of Facebook. You are the product that Facebook sells to the advertisers. They sell information about you because if someone is advertising for diapers, they don't want to send an ad to me. I don't have a baby. They want to target people who have babies, right?
Yeah.
So every minute you are on Facebook, they make more money from those revenue streams. And every moment you switch Facebook and do something else, they lose those revenue streams. Yeah. So you can see now why they don't have that button that says, which of my friends are nearby? Because you would push that button and I'd be like, oh, hey, Rob wants to meet up. We'd go for a coffee, right? But if that happens, that's a disaster for Facebook. We would both close Facebook and look into each other's eyes and talk to each other, at which point Facebook loses both of its revenue streams. So all of Facebook's engineers, all of their algorithms, all of this extraordinary intellectual and machinery power is geared towards one thing, how do I keep Rob scrolling, right? That's all they want to do. Just like the CEO of KFC only cares about one thing. Did Rob eat KFC today? Right. That's all he cares about. It doesn't matter whether he's a nice person or a nasty person. That's all he wants to know. All Facebook wants to know, and all the social media apps want to know is, did you keep scrolling? Right. So everything they do is designed to keep that happening. As Sean Parker, the biggest initial investor in Facebook, said, from the beginning, we designed it to hack people's attention. We knew what we were doing and we did it anyway. God only knows what it's doing to our kids. That's what he said, right? So this is really important because very often we'll think, oh, my attention's got worse, but it's the fault of the smartphone. And, that feels very disempowering because we're not going to become the Amish, right? We're not going to give up our smartphones, nor should we, right? But when you understand this, you can see that actually something much tighter and narrower has gone wrong. It's not the existence of the phone, it's the current business model that drives the apps we use. And we can change that, right? If you think about a historical analogy, you'll remember this, Rob, in the 70s, it was very common for people to paint their homes with lead paint, and we used leaded gasoline in our cars, right?
Yep.
And it was discovered, it'd actually been known for years, but the industry denied it, but it became undeniable by the 1970s that this was causing really severe problems for people's attention. It profoundly damages children's brains to be exposed to lead.
Yep.
So what did we do? We did not ban paint and we did not ban petroleum. We banned the lead in the paint and the petroleum. In the same way, we're not going to give up social media, nor should we, but we can ban the element in that social media that is maximally wrecking our attention. And that is a business model premised on the need to keep you scrolling. So I spent a lot of time discussing this with people in Silicon Valley, and one of them, Asa Raskin, who designed a key aspect of how the internet works, said to me, well, the first step in the solution is very simple. We need to ban the current business model, a business model that is about scanning you in order to figure out the weaknesses in your attention and selling them to the highest bidder. That is like the lead in lead paint. We will not allow it. But I said to him, okay, let's imagine we do that. What happens the next day? Right? Do I open Facebook and it says, sorry, we've gone fishing? He said, of course not. They would adopt a different business model. There's many different business models they could adopt. One would be like Netflix, a subscription model. You pay a small amount every month. Another would be like public ownership. So think about the sewers. Everyone listening, your nearest sewer. Before sewers, we had cholera. We had shit in the streets and cholera. And so we all built sewers, we all paid for the sewers to be built together, and we own the sewers together. Now, it might be that we want to say, just like we own the sewer pipes together, we want to own the information pipes together because we're getting the equivalent of cholera for our minds, right? Whatever the alternative model we move to is, that creates a completely different set of incentives. Suddenly, you become the customer, not the product, right? Suddenly, they're not going, how do we invade Rob in order to sell his attention? They're saying, well, what does Rob want?
That is fascinating. That is absolutely a fascinating idea. And also, I think one of the things that's of much the greatest concern for people is the amount of power that big tech actually has. The ability to put this in front of people or that in front of people, move this down, move this up, learn everything about them is really amazing. Let me jump topics quickly to the pandemic. How has this lockdowns and the lack of connection, facial micro expressions hidden behind, I say useless, whatever people want to do, but I believe that it's very detrimental to our mental health, and we know what it's doing to addiction rates and things like that. But what about in terms of focus? How has this new pandemic world affected this work that you're doing now in focus?
As the pandemic hit, loads of people I know said, oh, this is terrible, it's tragedy, but we're going to have loads of free time. I'm going to finally read that 900-page novel that I wanted to read. And everyone noticed no one read the 900-page novel during COVID, right? In fact, the Googling of how do I get my brain to work increased by, I think the figure is 3,000%.
Good Lord.
And I was trying to understand, why is that? Lots of people felt their attention, which was already bad, got significantly worse under COVID and the response to COVID. And I think there's several reasons, but I think the key reason is related to something I learned when I interviewed Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, who's now the Surgeon General of California and a completely amazing person. And Dr. Burke Harris said to me, okay, imagine one day you're attacked by a bear out of the blue and you survive. In the weeks and months that follow, something will happen to your attention. What will happen is your attention will flip from, focusing on the things in front of you, your kids or whatever, to scanning the horizon for risk and danger, because something has come out of the blue to attack you. So your whole mind, a big part of your mind is going to go, okay, I didn't anticipate that. What else could be trying to hit me that I can't anticipate, right? So this is called vigilance, right? You would flip into a state known as vigilance. Okay, now imagine you were attacked by a bear again. Then you would likely flip into a state called hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is where you find it very difficult to focus on the things in front of you because you are constantly scanning for risk and danger. Severely traumatized children, for example, are 32.6 times more likely to be diagnosed with attention problems, largely because they are scanning for danger all around them. A child who's been beaten or raped is going to find it hard to focus on math because they're scared and they're looking for other potential sources of risk and danger. And I interviewed a really fascinating guy, a child psychiatrist in Adelaide in Australia called Dr. John Giardini, who said to me, deep focus is a great strategy when you're safe, right?
Yeah.
Because, you sit down and read a book, you're going to grow, you're going to learn. Deep focus is a very dumb strategy if you're in danger. You'd be a fool who sat on a battlefield reading a novel. You're going to die, right? And I think part of what's happened in the last 18 months as we've all gone through this extraordinary collective trauma is we've been flipped into a state of greater vigilance, right? We are in danger from a virus. We're also profoundly disorientated by everything that's happened. And that will have an effect. There's evidence that just stress in general profoundly degrades your attention. And this kind of stress, I think, is producing a much higher rates of vigilance. And vigilance isn't that you can't pay attention, but it's that your attention has flipped to your attention is focused on detecting danger and not able to be fully applied to deep forms of focus. And I think that's happening to a hell of a lot of us.
From your research, you've done such a breadth of research, kind of from a higher level. What is it that you believe is the key to true happiness, to success in life? What is it that we should be after? What is your prescription for this? What do you concentrate on?
Oh, it's a very big question. What's the meaning of everything? But I think a lot about. I think a lot about a Russian psychologist I went to interview called Dmitry Leontiev, who interviewed in Moscow. He's one of the leading psychologists in Russia. He said a really interesting thing to me. I thought about a lot afterwards. He said, in Britain and in the United States, we talk a lot about happiness as the goal of life, right? Life is about happiness. The pursuit of happiness, obviously, is famously in the founding documents of the United States, and beautifully so. He said, when we hear this, we just laugh. He said, happiness will come and go. You have very little control over that. He said, life is not about happiness. Life is about meaning. And if you find a source of meaning, you can tolerate a great deal of unhappiness. Think even about something as simple as going to the dentist, right? You go to the dentist, you got toothache, and the dentist drills your face, right? In the context of meaning, he's drilling my face in order to, because afterwards I'll feel better. You can tolerate someone drilling your face. If someone drilled it outside that context of meaning, it would literally be a form of torture, right? Yeah. So
Interesting.
So he argued, and there's lots of people like Viktor Frankl, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, argued that we need to orient ourselves towards meaning, not happiness. And actually, if you orient yourself towards meaning, you'll be able to tolerate unhappiness and you may find happiness more. But if happiness is your goal, it will be much harder. And this is very relevant to attention, because attention, it is much easier to pay attention to things that are meaningful to you. If something is not meaningful to you, your attention will slip and slide off it like a greased pig, right? And this is why, as you know, I write in the book about 12 deep causes of our attention problems. And the last quarter is about why our kids are struggling to pay attention so much. And one key, there's many aspects of this, but one key aspect is that the way our schools work, which is no fault of the teachers who were not responsible for these changes, the way our schools work is a disaster for children paying attention. We have rebuilt the school system almost entirely around learning meaningless facts that they will then be tested on in the kids.
Yeah.
And this causes severe attention problems. You as an adult can't focus on something that's meaningless to you. Kids can't focus on things. When in 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act was introduced by President Bush, the second President Bush, which massively restructured the school system around rote learning and meaningless tests. And in the 4 years that followed, ADHD diagnoses went up by 23%.
Wow.
Children cannot focus on meaningless shit, nor should they, right?
Yeah.
So meaning to me is much more important than happiness, actually.
What does it mean for you personally? I'm curious in terms of what makes you tick. If it's not happiness that we're in the pursuit of, what is your personal mission and meaning then?
So for me, all of my books are about questions that I'm not an expert, I'm a journalist, right? So when I start, of course I have some guesses, but I don't know the answers to the questions I'm going to ask.
But you go and find them. That's the interesting thing.
But for me, that's about, so for example, Chasing the Scream, I wanted to know, well, what causes addiction? Has anywhere in the world solved this problem? What's going on here, right? With Lost Connections, why has depression gone up so much? With Stolen Focus, my most recent book, why are we all finding it so hard to pay attention? What can we do about it? And for me, that's driven by a few things, I think. One is just curiosity. It's really interesting to find this stuff out, right? To go and meet people who've done these fascinating experiments. And you're like, oh, and there's the joy of having something explained to you that you didn't understand. You feel like you start to feel like, oh, we've all had that joy of when you hear something go, oh, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So partly it's curiosity, partly it's just self-interest, right? Yeah. In the case of depression and focus, I wanted to understand these things for myself.
That's for me. Yeah.
And partly it's love for the people who have these problems, right? Yeah. So I think with each of the meaning for me is about the pleasure of realizing these are not sort of unfathomable mysteries. Actually, what's happening to us makes sense. We can understand it. If you talk to the people who've done the best work, and the joy of going to, obviously I went to a lot of places for Stolen Focus that have solved attention problems in all sorts of different ways. And the joy of seeing the problem and the solution, and then being able to talk to people like you and being like, hey, there's a different way of thinking about this. You think this is just a problem with you. Actually, it's happening to almost all of us. And, to me, the best analogy is, at the moment, it's like someone is pouring itching powder on us all day. And then that person is leaning over and going, hey, buddy, you might want to learn how to meditate because then you wouldn't scratch so much. And it's like, I'm in favor of meditation, but we need to stop the people who are pouring itching powder on us all day. Yeah. And there's got to be two levels in which we respond to this attention crisis. One is there are all sorts of things we can do as isolated individuals in our own lives to improve our attention. And I write a lot about them in Stolen Focus. But we've got to be honest with people, that will improve your attention, but it will only get you so far. Then we've got to band together and deal with the factors that are screwing with our ability to focus and pay attention, the equivalent of the people who are pouring itching powder on us. And we've got to do both. So
good. Well, as I said at the top, and anybody listening knows, I could ask you questions for several hours. I know that your time is limited. I'm really bummed out by that. I've got so many other things I want to ask you. But how can, when is the book going to come out and how can people connect with you?
So the book is out on the 25th of January, which I think will be before people hear this interview. Yeah. And anyone who wants to get information about where to get the physical book, the ebook, or the audio book can go to stolenfocusbook.com, where they can find out what a huge range of people have said about the book You can also listen for free to audio of lots of the experts we've talked about and loads of experts we haven't talked about. You can also see where to follow me on social media, although I won't speak back to you because I don't look at it. Although my assistant does it for me. I tell her what to say. But yeah, I got in trouble in a interview about a year ago because at the end they said to me, what's your Twitter? What's your Facebook? What's your Instagram? Then they said to me, what's your Snapchat? And I said, I am a 42-year-old man. The only 42-year-old men on Snapchat are certainly pedophiles, right? Why else are they there? And the host didn't laugh at all. And then later I looked it up and he's 50 and has quite a big Snapchat following. So I was like, oh dear, I accidentally accused him of being a pedophile, which is
that is so funny, man. Oh my God. Okay, well, I appreciate the time. This is Johann Hari. The book, as I said, I devoured the other two books. They were freaking fantastic. You will love. By the way, look him up on. Probably put a link in here as well. His TED Talk about addiction, Rat Park, what goes on in Portugal, how they have addressed it, chasing the screen, the last days of the war on drugs, first and last days of the war on drugs, depression, and then this book here on stolen focus. And I know my focus has been stolen. Why you can't pay attention. It's going to be a phenomenal book, and I will certainly devour that as well. My guest today, Johann Hari, thank you again for jumping on. Really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you for everything you're doing at Recovery Today, and to everyone listening. And I really appreciate it, Rob. Thank you so much.
Okay,
cheers.
my friend. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.